you might think, why not just use technology? But if you truly have an empire like the empire in Star Wars that just is abundant in energy and just is all like encompassing of a galaxy and just does not care, in a way, human stock is just a lot cheaper and easier to work with. You kind of just throw them on a planet. They'll keep reproducing. They'll keep transferring those skills. They can do highly detailed tasks and function. And even if you do have automation and drones, the specialties and the skills you need to maintain that automation is a lot higher than it is just to have some humble farmers, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, it just, then that brings in like ethical issues.
Yeah, well, our reference material for this is 40K in Star Wars. So I think you just predispose ethics are out the window. Hello and welcome to Entropy Rising, where we talk about science and futurism. I'm your host, Jacob, and as always, I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, Lucas. Lucas, how are you doing today?
It's a great day, Jake. How are you?
I'm doing great, and you're right, it is a great day. You know why?
Why?
This is 1 year of Entropy Rising. This is our 1 year episode.
Oh my God.
Yeah, did you even realize?
No.
Yeah, I barely did either,
My
but
goodness.
this will be released on the 1 year mark. So to those who've been with us this entire time, thank you so much. And we'll have to come up with some special episode to do down the road.
Yeah, year really blew by quick.
Yeah, it did. Also, before we dive into this topic, I did want to give a quick shout out. So we've had some people who are supporting us on Patreon, Alejandro Perez and Narrative Dude. Both of them are supporting us on our paid tiers. So I just wanted to say thank you both so much. I know I've talked to some of you through Patreon, so hopefully you've understood how much I appreciate your support and how much it means to me. And also to our free members, we appreciate you as well. Seeing you join, knowing you're listening to our post-episode discussions, it's a huge motivation for us. So we appreciate the paid members. You guys help us a ton financially support the show because it is a reoccurring cost to run the show. And to the free members, we appreciate your support as well.
Yes, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much.
So Lucas, today we are diving into the topic of specialized worlds. I think we're primarily going to focus on the concept of forge worlds and agri worlds, though if you have some other ideas, certainly bring them up. And we're going to be talking about how they can be used to make empire and how you would or wouldn't have them and what's the pros and cons of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds amazing. Another one that comes to mind is like maybe like a trade world.
Okay, like an economic world. Definitely an interesting one.
Yeah.
So let's first dive in and set the scene. So last week, we specifically talked about galactic empire. And I think if I had to say there was one key point in that episode, it's that it doesn't really happen or it doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, it wouldn't make sense to happen.
So in this episode, we're talking about these specialized worlds that in a sense would need a galactic empire to function. I mean, we will be talking about how you could have these worlds on a solar system scale. But I think by and large, when you think of a forge world and you think in an agri world, you're thinking of a situation like Warhammer 40K, where you have a galactic empire that has the ability to transport materials cheaply and easily between solar systems.
Yeah, and it just makes sense to think that way about having these worlds because you're sacrificing an entire planet to one function.
Yeah.
And when you do that, you sort of need to have like the privilege of having extra planets in your solar system. So us in our solar system around Sol, we have all these rocky planets and gaseous planets that are extra. But there are a lot of, stars out there that only have one or two planets. And, they can't really spare that. And if there is life on a place like that, they would have to break out and go to another area or another star system that's close by and take from those planets.
Potentially, in these situations, I think that's the idea. And, more to your point, if you're going to have an entire world that's dedicated to a singular purpose, like industry or farming food, right? That industry and food needs to go somewhere. You're not doing it for no reason.
Yeah.
And realistically, if you're talking about planetary scale farming or industry, then you're going to need a greater empire than that to support the demand for that. Which is why I think you would typically need something like a Warhammer 40K style empire to justify the use of a forge world. And we'll definitely talk about how that happens too.
Yeah, absolutely. And the only other reason that comes to mind as to why we would need something like that is if we're supporting, because in previous episodes, we've talked about why even colonize a new planet when you could just essentially live around the sun in O'Neill cylinders. Maybe there's an issue with growing crops in space, so we have to use agri-worlds, or we need all those materials to produce all of those, flying space stations.
Yeah, absolutely. I could see that situation happening. Before we dive into all the ifs, ands, and buts about why we would have these, I figure it might be good to first define what we're talking about, talk about what it would actually be like to be on these worlds,
Mhm.
assuming that they did exist, and then we can dive into why you would or wouldn't do them. How's that sound to you?
I mean, yeah, that makes perfect sense. I feel like we should start with the big kahuna then, like a forge world.
Yeah, that's a popular one.
Yeah. Like when we're thinking of a forge world, that's the one that makes the most sense to me,
Okay.
right? Because you're going to be using that to provide essentially metals that are needed to produce either megastructures or a lot of something. Which, when you're talking about humanity spanning out and completely populating their solar system, or even fragments of the galaxy that are close to their solar system, you'll need a lot of material for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, when we're talking about Forge World, we're typically talking about planets that are essentially used 100% for heavy industry of some sort.
Mm.
Typically, the base metal or base level, foundry level of industrial. You're refining metals, mining metals, refining them on these planets, maybe doing some heavy manufacturing on this planet. And the real draw to a Forge World is that this is a planet that you do not care about polluting.
Yeah.
If the people who live on that world only live on that world to support manufacturing, if they even have people in those worlds, realistically, you could do these with automations.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my image of a Forge World is heavily sculpted by Warhammer 40K.
Okay.
I know you probably are heavily sculpted by Stellaris.
Star Wars.
Oh, Star Wars, of course. Well, that's one we'll agree with, because I think Star Wars and Warhammer have very similar depictions of Forge Worlds. These are hellish worlds. They're hot. They're toxic. Typically, I find they're depicted with a thick atmosphere of you can't even see the sun because it's covered in smog and
Always, it's like, imagine like the worst factory area that you can depict, and then it's just that smog is, like you said, just completely encompassing that planet. Sunlight doesn't break through, and it's just hot and phosphorus.
So that's actually the first area where I might start to disagree with how science fiction depicts these worlds.
Okay.
Because when you're thinking about a stellar empire and you're thinking about how to fuel that. Now, granted, Star Wars and Warhammer, energy is not a concern. It's kind of just taken for granted that space travel is cheap and energy is not something you care about. But in a more realistic setting, if you do care about energy, realistically, I don't think you're going to want your Forge world to have a thick atmosphere. For one, that traps heat, so it makes it more inhospitable, which even if you don't care about it being more inhospitable, at a certain point, that'll be an issue and that'll limit production. Because
Right.
we've talked about in so many episodes, waste heat is always your limiting factor. And secondly, having a thick atmosphere typically implies you have a heavy gravity well. And also, it's going to add air resistance, which makes it harder to get material off your planet. So I think, contrary to how it's depicted, I think your ideal Forge world would actually be something more like Mercury, a planet that is smaller, metal rich, and has no atmosphere. Now, of course, over time, if you're polluting the planet, maybe you will build up a slightly thicker atmosphere, but I don't think you're going to get, to like Venus levels of thick atmosphere, because that starts to be counterproductive. And after all, the whole point of these worlds is to like maximize productivity.
Yeah, I mean, that completely makes sense. It's like, if you want to essentially create a material and launch it off of a planet, going for one that has the least amount of gravity and atmosphere just makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what is happening when you have this planet and you're just heating it up and it doesn't have really an atmosphere to dissipate that heat? Like, you need to have some sort of an atmosphere there so that you can, burn off like that excess heat and actually cool these materials to turn them into a metal.
So yes and no. So I understand what you're saying, and you are right. From an individual machinery perspective, operating in vacuum means it's harder for that machine to dissipate heat. The opposite of that, though, is not true. A planet with no atmosphere will heat slower, because remember, atmospheres trap heat.
Right.
So you would need a way to get heat away from your manufactories. And, you could definitely do something like carry that heat away with water cooling to a massive radiator bank, or just have radiators built into the machines to radiate those out into space or the thin atmosphere that does exist on the planet. But not having an atmosphere on the planet would be a benefit overall, because you're not trapping that heat. It's able to radiate away into space.
I see. And in a sense, it doesn't matter if you don't have anywhere to put your metals to cool if the entire planet is a giant ball of fire.
That's true, exactly. And you can also pump your waste heat into the planet itself. I mean, there's, of course, a limiting return to that, but planets tend to be big, so you can get away with using the planet as a heat sink for quite a while before it starts to get too hot.
Yeah.
And that could also be a benefit, though, because if you're able to concentrate the heat with a heat pump enough, you could potentially be pumping your waste heat ahead of your mining efforts to go ahead and soften up the rocks and have them at a more ideal temperature to make mining easier, to go ahead and preheat them for manufacturing while also getting rid of your waste heat.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. Usually, when you see a Forge world depicted, it's like mostly lava,
Yeah, I
right?
know,
Like
right?
like it's these huge fountains of lava that are just pouring into vats that are getting like sorted into different materials by their density and then cooled, and then that's just getting cut up and processed and sent out into space. And in my example, to the Empire to build their gigantic, star destroyers, and then in Warhammer 40K to field hundreds of billions of space marines.
Yes, yes. And the entire planet's dedicated to weapon production, which with a civilization that large is perfectly reasonable.
Of course, yeah. Well, that's why I feel like it just feels so right to think about these huge galactic empires on that scale producing these worlds, because it's like we can just have one planet making weapons and that's it. And then another planet making chairs. Like, I don't know.
Which I don't know if you really want to do it like that, because like, yes, having one planet manufacture one thing, if you need that much of that material, is kind of nice because you can specialize in production, but it also leaves you incredibly vulnerable to supply chain shortages. Because if something goes on with that planet, if your enemy, comes and hits it with a relativistic kill missile, or, some other natural disaster happens, you've just lost your entire manufacturing capacity of that material.
Yeah.
And this is one of the key issues with Forge Worlds and also Agri Worlds, is that when you concentrate your manufacturing, you make yourself very vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes perfect sense. Like, we wouldn't want all of our metal production, even if we don't generalize, that specifically like into one product. But if we were relying heavily on just one planet for, 90% of our metal production, and then something goes wrong, like that would be catastrophic.
Yeah, exactly. Either something goes wrong or it can just be simple logistics issues. If you're not able to get enough ships to that planet to carry the material away, now your Space Marine doesn't have a laser to, kill whatever it is Warhammer Marines kill.
Yeah.
Orcs, I think. Yeah.
That's one of them.
Yeah. So, no, that is one of the biggest concerns with these types of planets. And even if, like you said, you do diversify the manufacturing on the planet itself, the fact that it's all contained on that one planet or a handful of planets is an inherent limiting factor.
Well, then, as we're thinking about, of course, that would be thought about by these people that are planning either the production of a megastructure or something else. But then, I mean, the only way that I see around that is you have 2 planets, but then, it's like you need 3. So then that just adds on more to this needs to be a massive solar system or galaxy spanning.
Well, either way, you're still concentrating. And yeah, you're right. But I mean, there's a difference when we're talking about Forge Worlds, even in a civilization, galaxy spanning civilization sense. That's still a concentration of resources, even if you have a million Forge Worlds, versus the alternative, which is you have mixed planets that have civilization centers and industry and agriculture, kind of like how Earth is. You might have tens of billions of those. So it's much harder to actually wipe out the industrial capability of a civilization if every single planet can do a little bit of everything versus, one subset of planets that does manufacturing. There's pros and cons to both.
Of course.
The con to that, of course, is you're polluting planets where people want to live on.
Right. And when you do think about it, like just going back to Stellaris, because this is the most prevalent that I see in them, right? You build those worlds in those pockets because you essentially increase efficiency, and by increasing efficiency only by 10%, but over 15 Forge worlds that you have, that it makes a huge difference in metal production.
Absolutely.
Right. And it would be the same thing because, like you said, you could optimize those planets for that production. But let's dial it back to a more realistic standpoint of just we have maybe 3 stars that we can get to in a lifetime that it would even make sense in bringing metals back if we could go 85, 90% the speed of light. We would probably use that for more non-essential production and continue having the planets that we inhabit be self-sustaining, at least to a point.
I think if you're on that type of scale where you can only reach 3 stars, I don't think you're going to have a Forge World, one Forge World supplying all 3 of those stars. I think you're probably doing manufacturing locally in each solar system, because at that point, if you can only reach 3 stars, that tells me that traveling between the stars is relatively expensive.
Right.
So probably not worth it in that situation.
Yeah. But I mean, even so, but then it's just back to the same point of you just have the one. And if something goes wrong, that could cause huge issues. So I think that planets would still be self-sustaining. And then a Forge World would be almost created with, like a project in mind.
Yeah,
like a megastructure.
Yeah, I could see that. Or just a general industry base. When we're talking about a more realistic sense of Forge Worlds, I mentioned Mercury, and we can 100% see a situation where Mercury could become a forge world for our civilization because it's kind of fits that criteria. It has lower gravity than Earth. It's metal rich. Those metals are more concentrated than the asteroid belt, and there's more of them. And like I said, there's little atmosphere. So that could be a great example if you wanted to set up industry there, because sometimes it is beneficial to have some gravity when it comes to manufacturing processes. Metal refining is a great example of that because when you do that in a gravity field, your impurities float to the top versus doing that in zero gravity. So yeah, maybe we could use Mercury and mine it and use it as a huge industry base for humanity. And we could just be cranking out O'Neill cylinders on Mercury. And that could be essentially a forge world in our own solar system just for our solar system. So you don't need necessarily galactic spanning empires. You can still have them on a local scale as well.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And that is like much more realistic to me because like we talked about in the last episode, spanning a whole galaxy, as a singular empire that will be feeding materials to each other across hundreds of stars, just unless wormholes somehow rip space-time and we can fly between them, it just doesn't make sense.
I agree. And this whole episode is predicated on the idea of let's just assume that you can move materials reasonably cheaply across.
Okay.
Which is what you would need in order to have a galaxy-spanning empire in general, and especially a galaxy-spanning empire that has local industry centers like Forge Worlds that are supplying the empire as a whole. But if we want to talk about more realistic situations of having Forge Worlds, one of the, I think, rather interesting ones, and this, I do kind of agree with the idea of a Forge World being a radioactive hellscape like you see in 40K. Because, right, if you're doing a bunch of heavy machinery, that's usually not a very comfortable place to live. And I think that might be right, at least in the beginning. But interestingly, one of the largest byproducts of metal smelting is oxygen. Usually when you're purifying metals, what you're really doing is removing the oxides and other impurities from that metal and releasing it in the atmosphere.
Right.
So it's very possible that we could actually see Forge Worlds being the first step in terraforming a planet. Because if you're going to terraform a planet, you're destroying it regardless. I mean, it is a very destructive process. So you're coming to a planet and you're building out all of this heavy machinery because you want to get as much manufacturing as you can. And a happy byproduct of that manufacturing is you're releasing tons of oxygen and carbon dioxide and nitrogen, which you could then later on, much easier, once you've got all the metal you want, you've justified the expense of coming to that planet through the industry. And now all you need to do is come back and clean up some of the things in the atmosphere you don't like, and you can keep the things you do like the oxygen and the carbon dioxide.
Now, that makes a really interesting point, actually, because one of the thoughts for terraforming is just essentially glassing the surface of a planet, right? And that's sort of what you're doing, just in a more productive way, but much slower. But it kind of does produce like an atmosphere on the planet. It reduces the weight on the planet, and then it makes all the soil and everything nitrogen rich and kind of soil-like, instead of just being like what a lot of planets are is, just super dense, toxic wastelands.
Yeah, not sure about it making the soil better. I think you would probably have to come and do that as part of the cleaning up effort once you're done with the industry, but it definitely does give you some of the raw materials you need to do it.
Well, the reason why I think that is because think of like volcanoes, for example, right? They're essentially producing superheated rock, and metal. And then they're oozing that out. And when that oozes out and after that breaks down for a long time, it turns into volcanic ash or like volcanic rich soil, which grows the best crops.
Yeah, that's true. And I guess a benefit of this too is if you are releasing all of these materials, especially because you're going to be releasing a lot of oxygen, carbon dioxide, water vapor, you will start a weathering process, which will help to break down the regolith and turn it into more tolerable soils. Again, I still think you're going to have to come back and put some energy and effort into making that useful, but you've at least started the work on a planetary scale.
Yeah.
And of course, this isn't happening overnight. I mean, this might be over hundreds of lifetimes that a planet goes from industry to habitable.
Yeah, I mean, but it could essentially be like if you've done this for long enough, it's like you go right from your Forge worlds and then just convert them into Agri worlds.
Yeah. So speaking of Agri worlds, I guess we can dive into that too.
Yeah, I mean, now that's one that kind of makes sense because if you're building a space station that's self-sustaining, right? And first, we should actually talk about like what an Agri world would be, if that's not super obvious. It's just a planet that is completely built and designed to produce food for people, whether that be through farming or, the production of crops through like towers, however that would be. And the big question with that is, wouldn't it just be easier to, have that food be something that's produced wherever the people are?
And I fully agree with you, but I can see a justification for Forge World I do struggle to see a justification for agri worlds because, like you're saying, it's a perishable item that you're making. Presumably, if you're refining metals, it doesn't matter how long it takes to get to the next star. It's not going to, go bad. That's not true with food.
Right.
So in addition to needing some sort of FTL or very quick method to transport between solar systems, you also need it to be cheap enough to justify shipping food. Like, why are you making your food on one planet and shipping it across stars to another planet? You must have really cheap space travel at that point.
Yeah. I mean, well, let's think about it on just like a singular solar system standpoint. The only reason why I could see that making sense for delivering food amongst our own solar system is if it was more livestock than it was crops. Because crops would be easier to manage in space than I feel like livestock would be, just because I don't know, because when you think of an O'Neill cylinder and the size that they could be, livestock could be managed just as easily as it could be on Earth.
I also just think by this point, you could probably just grow your own meat and skip the animal portion of it. Just grow a steak.
I guess we're already doing that now, right?
That's technology we're already seeing now. So, there's realistically growing an entire animal just to harvest its meat. Not only is there a lot of ethical concerns there, but it's just wasteful.
It is wasteful.
So being able to directly dump that energy into growing the bit of the animal you want is way better going forward. And yeah, you can do that in an O'Neill cylinder just as easy as a planet, except for you don't need to ship it up a gravity well. And unlike a forge world, right? An agri world, you're going to need a thick atmosphere of some sort and, reasonable conditions to support those plants. So it's going to be more expensive to get it off the planet's surface. And in addition to that, and this is the main issue I have with agri worlds in general, you're just giving up such a useful planet just to make food. I mean, the odds of finding another planet that can support human life is so rare. Why would you take the few gems that are out there and dedicate it to industry? At least with Forge Worlds, you can take these, quite frankly, horrible places that we don't want to live on or can't live on, and you're using them to make industry. Cool, that makes sense. But to take these jewels that exist in this, galaxy and dedicate those to industry, to me, is just absurd.
Yeah, no, I mean, you make a good point there, too, because if it can support plant life, it can support human life, and then why wouldn't we live there?
To an extent, not necessarily, but it would be very easy to terraform it to support human life.
Yeah, no, I mean
it could be for example, a planet with 50% carbon dioxide. That's fine for plants. That wouldn't work for us, but that's still pretty close to being able to support us.
I mean, that definitely makes sense to me. Now that you put it that way, that is quite useless.
Yeah, I agree. And if they did exist, the depictions we see in science fiction, they vary. And I think a lot of people seem to have the idea of agri worlds being a little utopian. Not utopian, I feel like that's a bit far, but nice places to live. I think they're typically depicted as these beautiful fields of golden wheat with like relatively rural societies, right? That's, I think, a depiction I see a lot in science fiction.
I think that's fair to say.
I think that's probably not going to be the case.
That's how I was envisioning it.
Yeah, I think they're going to be just as terrible to live on as Forge Worlds. Industrial agriculture is not as idyllic as people seem to think that it is. It's not, mom and pop on a farm with a red barn and their cow. No, it's pretty mechanized and unfriendly to people. You have industrial pesticides, industrial fertilizers, heavy machinery. It's not safe. The water's going to be toxic. There's going to be algae blooms everywhere because you're dumping fertilizer on everything. I mean, sure, you could get around a lot of that with technology, but I'm imagining this more as like, pure industry-driven agriculture, which is very damaging to planets.
I mean, imagine though, like if they didn't need pesticides and algae just didn't exist.
Yeah,
because if they just brought seeds and robots to the planet, then perhaps they could avoid insects and other life forms entirely.
I think unlikely, just because one, that means that the planet itself can't support life. Because realistically, if you don't have pests and you don't have algae on the planet already, because realistically, if this is a planet that can support life, I assume that it would support life of some type on its own. So even if you don't bring pests, there's probably pests that exist on that planet already.
That is fair. But, we see other planets out there that could support life, but have no evidence of it. So it is possible that it is a planet that could support life, but just doesn't.
I don't know of any planets that could support life.
Well, they call them super Earths, right? Like planets that are, rocky, that have water, that have atmospheres, that are in a Goldilocks zone.
Yeah, we don't have the data on those yet just to know if they do have life. We have observed some that have potential biomarkers, but we can't really conclusively say if those do or don't support life yet.
Of course. But I'm just saying we haven't found life out there yet.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not confirmed that every planet that could have life would have life.
You are absolutely correct. There is a lot of debates, and I think we've talked about this before.
We have, yeah.
So it is possible that life is just extremely rare to get started. There's different schools of thought on that. I tend to think that life in and of itself forming is actually relatively easy to happen. I think it's just that the conditions for life to form are rare.
Yeah, and I do agree with you on that. I'm just saying, just like how you are, we don't know.
We don't know. That's true. But even if you if you find a perfect planet that could support life and it's sterile for whatever reason, realistically, the odds of you not accidentally bringing pest on that planet are pretty slim anyways.
Yeah. Well, the only reason why I'm defending this point is because it would actually be one of the only reasons that would make sense to have a planet like that to begin with. Because when we have all of these people living on an O'Neill cylinder and they have farms on there, the odds of them having pests on that could be very high. And that could make the production of crops much more expensive for the reason that you're saying. But if we can do it on a planet that is entirely sterile prior and is in super controlled conditions, then we could have essentially crops that are built around perfect conditions without natural predators or any kind of disease that could kill them.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna have to disagree with that just because I think it's much easier to have perfectly sterile conditions in a space habitat than on a planetary scale. And you could definitely do orbital farms like O'Neill cylinders dedicated to just agriculture that people don't live on and use those to get food to the places where people do live.
That's a good point.
In fact, I think that's what you realistically would do. I don't think you would be growing the food on an O'Neill cylinder to feed the people who live on that O'Neill cylinder. I think you would have separate space farms dedicated to agriculture, and those can be completely sterilized, completely controlled. Nothing is impossible. Well, there are impossible things. It's not impossible to completely sterilize a planet and make sure that not a single pest or contaminant gets into it. With empires these size, sure. I'll grant that maybe that's possible, but it is a whole hell of a lot more effort to do that on a planetary scale than on, these individual orbital farms. And the planetary scale, if something does go wrong, you've contaminated the entire planet. At least with orbital farms, if one gets contaminated, that's one farm. You might have millions.
I mean, it just comes back to the point of why even consider planets in the first place when you could just do it easier on a space station.
Yeah, especially for something like agriculture. I think it just makes way more sense to do that in orbital space farms to feed populations already in space than to try to dedicate an entire planet to it.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely does. I was really trying to fight it there.
Yeah,
I was.
No, I get it. Yeah.
But you got to play devil's advocate for these ideas. But no, it at the end of the day, it just doesn't make sense, especially on a planet where you could have people that are willing to pay to live on a planet.
And that's my biggest issue with them. If you have a planet that can support crops, why would you not use that for people?
Yeah.
But if you did have them, they could still be horrible industrial agricultural messes, just as good as Forge worlds. So they don't necessarily have to be idyllic farm worlds like we see depicted sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Though that does bring us to an interesting idea that I do like. If you're going to just assume that you have agro worlds for whatever reason, maybe you just really want them, you're the Empire or something. I do particularly like the idea of keeping civilizations or populations on these planets at an artificially low level of technology and basically at an agrarian level just to run your planet for you. Maybe you do allow them to interact with your industrial machinery, but, to them, it's almost like a god, right? Like they don't understand how any of it works, but they know like, okay, I go and I press these buttons or I haul the big metal god machine drops off the crop and I'll manually shook the corn with my hands or stuff like that.
It's it is actually interesting that you say that because that is kind of how I don't know, you probably haven't watched Andor. It's a Star Wars series. Anyways, they have an agro world there, and on that agro world, the people that farm there use essentially ancient equipment that has been there for forever, and they know that the Empire is up there, but these people live very humbly, and they harvest the crops in a similar way that you would envision an agro world to be, like mom and pop farmers out there managing their plot of farm. And then they just have to meet a quota.
Yeah. And I'm sure because Star Wars is very dystopian.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
I could almost see, ignoring the broader issue of the agro world, I could almost see a reason for doing this. You might think, why not just use technology? But if you truly have an empire like the Empire in Star Wars that just is abundant in energy and just is all like encompassing of a galaxy and just does not care, In a way, human stock is just a lot cheaper and easier to work with. You kind of just throw them on a planet. They'll keep reproducing. They'll keep transferring those skills. They can do highly detailed tasks and function. And even if you do have automation and drones, the specialties and the skills you need to maintain that automation is a lot higher than it is just to have some humble farmers, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, it just then that brings in like ethical issues.
Yeah, well, our reference material for this is 40K in Star Wars. So I think you just predispose ethics are out the window.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. If you got to crack a couple eggs to make a galactic omelet. It's just how that is.
I'm not sure ethics exist in the 40K universe.
Oh, no. No, they're past that.
Yeah.
They're past ethics and your feelings. It is do you get to see another day and we need blood for the blood god?
Yes, exactly. So.
But yeah, no, that's very funny. But it just aside, Agri-World's probably just would not be a realistic thing that would happen.
Yeah, I think not. I just think, and you can be much more, if you're that desperate for food, I just think there's much better ways to go about it than dedicating a whole planet. And if you did need that much food, why not do vertical farming on the planet that needs the food? It's a lot cheaper than, transporting it across the galaxy.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. There are two more worlds that I want to talk about. It's just the only issue that I run into is, could a space station just do it better?
Yeah, and that's kind of the issue with dedicated worlds in general.
Yeah, but it is still a fun topic, so I wanted to bring them up anyways. One is one that we already talked about, a world of commerce, right? And then another one is essentially a fortress world.
Okay, let's tackle them one by one. So the world of commerce, right? I think that's effectively going to be an ecumenopolis. It's probably just going to be a huge trade hub, maybe a planetary or a galactic center. And it doesn't really produce anything except for bureaucracy.
Yeah. It is a place of like a central meeting point for governments. It's a place where trade goods come and are stored securely. And essentially like a gigantic truck stop.
Yeah, this is Trantor from, the Foundation series, that galactic empire. I don't know if there's I guess Coruscant would be a great example.
Yeah, Coruscant, they actually have a lot, many different worlds that are set up. Like Naboo is another one that's like a government run world.
So again, this falls into all the same issues that we're going to see with all of these. Predisposing that you have a galactic empire. And I don't really have any problems with them. I think ecumenopolises could function in that type of environment.
Of course.
And I think it would make sense that they could be dedicated solely to managing your galactic empire. I mean, if you've got quadrillions of people, you might have a planet with a couple 100 billion inhabitants that are solely dedicated to the higher rungs of your government.
Yeah. No, I mean that is definitely true. You could have them in there, and then you also have to think about like you can specify living conditions. Things can be a little bit more open than they would be on the space station. Well, I guess that's not true because you could, if these people have the money, they could make a space station whatever they want. But setting space stations aside, right? You could sort of turn this into a place where you have the higher class, like we see in Coruscant and other ecumenopolises, where they live amongst the clouds, and then you just have people that are bombarded with advertisements from all the companies that live on this planet, and they just squander over pennies down in this.
So you don't want a commerce world. You want a capitalist like world of just soaking money from.
No, I'm just saying that is the examples that I've seen. Okay. Is it's like because you can't have a planet. Well, I guess you could have a planet completely structured around government and commerce, and everybody sort of works amongst the government. It's just the higher levels live higher up because nobody wants to live down.
This could be a world that's completely sustained by taxes. I mean, if you've got a galactic empire the size that we see in some of these science fiction worlds, then supporting an entire planet just from tax revenue is you could support solar systems from tax revenue. Yeah. It's really hard to comprehend how vast in scale these empires would be.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely could. And that would actually make more sense because then when everybody meets, like members of Senate, members of Congress, when they meet, they already have a home there.
Yeah.
They already live there, even though, of course, they would want to spend time on the planet or the district that they're representing because they're government officials. But, I mean, that definitely makes sense to me that a planet like that would exist.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that it could exist in the hypothetical situation of, you essentially need FTL travel and FTL communication and galactic empire. But if you have those things, then I see no problem with that as a thing to keep all of your government together, as long as your enemy doesn't come and take you out with a relativistic kill missile. But
oh, yeah, that's again, that would be a big problem, right? If they just killed everybody who ran stuff.
But I don't really have an issue with that because if we look at the real world, we see concentrations of government because it just makes the bureaucracy move slightly faster. So I do think that it could happen. And I think we have reasonable examples of that happening in the real world. Not on that scale, of course, but we have cities, Washington, D.C., for example. So we see something like that.
You're definitely right. We see that on a smaller scale. A lot of the representatives that, represent around the country and Congress members, they have homes in Washington, D.C. or around that area just because they could be there for months at a time solving different things. So, they live in that area, and that area is very heavily populated with just government all the time.
Yeah. And what was the second example you had?
Fortress worlds.
Fortress, okay.
Is one that we see. You see them in 40K, you see them in Star Wars, you see them in Stellaris. Now, the reason why I have issues with this on a realistic level is because they're usually centered around the fact that they have some way of stopping people from moving around them before they get to other planets. So this would be something like a FTL inhibitor.
Yeah, so I know in Star Wars you have hyperspace lanes. There is an in-universe reason that you might have a stronghold because you can actually interrupt traffic. In a real situation, unless you have something like a wormhole network where all the traffic has to funnel through a solar system, trying to do a fortress makes zero sense.
Yeah. Now, the only reason why I could see that, and this is just assuming that you would have a standing military being produced, is that same planet also houses your military production facilities. Then you would want, a pretty amassed planet of defense as well, centered around all those valuable resources that are being put into the production of weapons, armor, ships, whatever.
Besides the same issue of do you really want to concentrate all of your military in one place for, just so that your enemy can come and cut off your head. But I do think you could reasonably see that. I mean, concentrating military forces in bases is not unheard of. We see that in the real world. I mean, it's not like you're going to put your entire military on one planet, but you could have planets that are dedicated to, military and supporting that military. And if you don't have a society that's as dystopian as 40K, where you are basically abducted and live in the military, if you have a more enlightened society that only has a regular military, then potentially that planet not only needs to serve as a training ground to host your military, but it needs to have civilizations outside of that. You need to have a place for the person to live when they're not actively on drill. You're going to have civilians on that planet that are going to provide services to the military as a whole. So you could have a planet that functions like Earth. You have a diverse set of industries, but the whole goal of all of that is to support the gigantic, maybe continent-wide military presence on that planet.
Yeah. No, I mean, that makes complete sense, right? And we I guess that would be the closest logical thing to what would be depicted in these different fictional events as a fortress world.
It would essentially be like a military town just on steroids.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess the best way to look at it is if we already have concentrations here on Earth of like communities that are centered around something, it would be possible to have it as a planet. Absolutely. But again, it would just make more sense to build those spaceships in space.
Yeah.
Right. But I don't know. It's hard, right? Because we're trying to talk more about fictional events that could happen. I just have to keep reassuring that, okay, I'm not thinking about it not being possible.
Yeah. And, of course, if you're an aspiring science fiction author and you just really want an agri world or a forward world, you can come up with whatever in-universe reason that you want for that.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. And if you set the initial starting conditions correctly, you can have justifications for why your specific example of a world might need forge worlds or agri worlds or military worlds, like you said. Like a great example is how Star Wars has hyperspace lanes.
Yeah.
That changes the game entirely.
That's true.
So at the end of the day, especially when talking about hypotheticals, you really just got to think about what is it that I want out of my in-universe example. And even when we're trying to talk about realistic examples, like what we do here on the podcast, we still need to set what we pre-assume the conditions of the universe are going to be. I assume that hyperspace lanes and wormhole travel isn't real, but there's nothing wrong with talking about them because who knows?
Yeah, it just takes. I feel like we've just reassured each other so many times. Like, okay, assuming, right, that we're not using a space station, but no, I mean, you can talk about whatever you want, and it's just plain fun to think about these different things and talk about them.
So quick rundown of the list. Forge worlds, reasonably possible, maybe even with real physics and no FTL. We could see that being in like a solar system example.
That makes sense to me. Yeah. Yes.
Agri worlds?
No. Even space stations do it better.
Yeah, unless you just really want one for some reason.
Well, yeah. I mean, it is satisfying to have like your own little planet for everything, but satisfying it won't be enough to sacrifice a whole livable planet.
Yeah. You said you called it commerce world.
Mm-hmm.
Probably going to do more than just commerce, but having specialized worlds that do nothing but bureaucracy, whether that's commerce or government, I think is possible in this context.
Absolutely. Just thinking back to an Ecumenopolis, like a planet that is essentially there to have a bunch of people on it for some reason, is of course going to be a planet that, has a lot of money running through it and has government.
Yeah. And then finally, fortress worlds.
No.
Plausible.
I mean, it's,
if you have a galactic empire, you might have a military town that's essentially scaled up to be world size. But I don't think you're going to have, a fortress like how you see in.
No, you'll probably have like a planet that's focused on training because it offers different conditions that could be there. And, but your production probably will still happen in space just because it's easier.
Yeah.
But yeah, it would be more like a giant military town / academy.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. Well, I think that's all I have to say about specialized worlds. How about you?
I think so too. Yeah, it was a fun topic to talk about.
I really enjoyed it. This was fun. I like the conversation here. Thank you all so much for listening. Join us next week. We're going to be talking about augmented reality and how that might be shaping our lives here in the near future.
Yeah, wow. That'll be a crazy topic to discuss.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for listening and take care.
Thank you guys so much. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.